Between 465 and 467, the new Roman Empire struck killing blows to timeless enemies, signalling that the wars were coming to an end. The last vassals of the Sassanid court were exterminated, and the last men-at-arms who might have tried to revive it faced the same fate. In northern Africa, the combined forces of Britannian and Western Rome closed in on the last hostile desert lords. And in Europe, the great Alaman kingdom was systematically deconstructed. Its troops were killed, and its people were relocated west. They were Roman people now. With such dominance over the known world, it was not only an end to the century of war that was being heralded, but a new age entirely, the Roman Age, where Rome was not just the strongest empire, but for all intents and purposes, the only empire. No longer would people ask how Rome would deal with its enemies, but instead how it would deal with its people, many of whom had so recently fallen into the former category. Many answered the question by looking to the Senate in Rome. They were a body of lawmakers whose power had risen and waned over the decades, but was now rising higher than ever in the face of decreasing need to bow to the Constantian dynasty of statesmen. One particular statesman, however, was utterly convinced of the folly of letting such a divided and corruptible group take power. It had been proven, this man reasoned, that a single ruler was easier for the people to follow and more decisive when crisis struck. Thus, Gaius Caonius Verus, claiming himself the inheritor of the rights of Magister, or Supreme Commander, marched the most elite men the world could offer to Rome, swords drawn. He cited his legal right to rule the whole empire and waited for the one who must challenge him to arrive. To the north, encamped in the unthawing snows of Germania, was the man who had not claimed the magisterium, but had it forced upon him by the Senate. His father had been magister, and had also made sure that the position was hereditary, an endeavour he had come to regret as Verus knew. But still, Eutropius Acilius Salutius was the legal ruler of Rome. The news from the capital had not reached him, and so his previous mandate remained his only concern: remove the threat of barbarian invasion. He had conquered Tulliferdum, the last Alaman bastion within striking distance of the Roman border. The Senate's orders had been to relocate the population to colonies in the west, but the advice of his younger brother, Anicius Piso, led him to grant the Germans self-rule as friends of Rome, a very old-fashioned idea by this point in history. There was now little the Alamans could do to harm the towering Romans. Still, one more enemy was left to quell. Eutropius learned that the homeland of the Angles was open to attack, and attack he did. The warriors he encountered were killed or drafted into the legions. The remaining Angle territories, mostly lodged in the inhospitable corners of the frozen north, agreed to end the war immediately. Ignorant of the brewing storm over Rome, the Magister and his men shared great cheer and celebrated the coming end to their long marches and cold nights. Far away, another Roman project was coming to an end, although it may be more accurate to call it the project of a particular Roman. Legate Gratianus Canaleus Costa had been charged with crushing resistance to Roman rule in the east, and had taken it upon himself to simply kill anyone who didn't live close enough to an outpost of the empire. He was joined in this pursuit by the less enthusiastic Septimus Vitellius Pollio, cousin of the Magister, and a man desperate to win some political standing before the wars were over. Unfortunately, he was stuck in the cold shadow of Costa, a shadow cast by burning fields. It would not be him who was remembered for the eastern victories at the current rate, but the situation was about to change. In Rome, Verus had found the Senate to be not so intimidated by his arrival. They would not pass a motion to recognise his inheritance of the magisterium by the deathbed wish of the first magister, Septimus Gratius Gurgus. For many of his troops, this was a betrayal of the hard-earned authority of the previous conqueror. For others, it was a display of respect for the law and intolerance for Verus's hardline approach. When Verus finally declared that he would restore his power by force, the Praetorian Legion was split down the middle. Half marched with him out of the capital, seeking to gain support from the surrounding cities before returning in conquest, while the other half pledged their swords to the city guard commander, hoping Verus would have no chance of success. It was no longer just a disputed succession, but a full-blown civil war. News spread quickly across the empire. The sudden apparent weakness led an uneasy neighbour, the exiled Caucasian separatists, to declare their support for Verus, perhaps suspecting that backing him would bring grand rewards upon his victory. The Roman commanders received the news just days or even hours before orders from the Senate that they publicly condemn Verus and his troops. To the Senate's surprise, many of their own troops were of the same mind as Verus. They lamented the stealing away of power from their heroes, and agreed with the rhetoric that a magister on the Senate's leash was just as likely to leave the empire to rot as to serve it. Veteran leaders took the troops that supported them and split legions from Britannia and Gaul. So far from Verus, and so far from supplies, however, they faced an uphill battle. Their problem would be shared by any commander who agreed with the rebel cause. The people wanted none of the chaos such a dispute would bring. It was time for peace, and the Senate's peace was good enough. One city declared their full support for Verus, Carolis in Sardinia. The governor, Sulla, prepared a small army to join the cause, but there was no viable way for them to supply the armies already in the field. This would, then, be a very short war unless the rebels could capture territory immediately. In the east there was rebellion also, although far more standard in its nature. What remained of the kingdom of Macran had betrayed Rome and declared independence, thinking that all of Rome's local armies were now further north, stirring up hatred against the empire with their genocidal campaign. They were right about the hatred, but in fact the legion of Anicius Vespanius Basileus had stayed behind and quickly stamped the fires of independence out, his final action before his retirement from public life the next year. He spared the lives of the civilian population, an act that the infamous Costa likely would have scoffed at. Costa was due to return from his march to resupply, but as the Roman armies came into contact with Anicius, it was clear something had gone wrong. A good quarter or more of the troops had deserted, Legate Costa with them. He had apparently disappeared into the land he had terrorized with some like-minded men, not wishing to return to civilization just yet. The matter was not serious as far as the remaining Roman commanders were concerned. At least now, with Costa gone, the empire had a chance to make the peace it enforced seem worth the unprecedented cost in lives. In Central Europe, Eutropius, the now disputed magister, had been in the middle of relocating the Angel population when he heard of the challenge to his authority. While assured that the Senate could deal with the situation, he knew that for the sake of history, it had to be him to lead the campaign against the rebels. He abandoned his men, leaving them with Legate Piso, and rushed back to Rome on horseback with only his Praetorian Guard. Piso then had a large army to play with, and was receiving fresh reports that the Almans were gathering a new army to the east. Rome had lost interest in its wars, it seemed, but Piso and his men were determined to see things through to the very end. As they prepared for a difficult march through early snows, another commander was taking matters into their own hands. Quintus Appius Vitellius, an outcast from the Senate who kept his military post by popular demand, marched away from the brewing trouble in Gaul and into the ghost towns of Germania. The Caucasian separatists had laid claim to the ruins of Ubersis, the former capital of the great Alaman kingdom that had dominated Central Europe. Their claim amounted to nothing more than a banner lodged into a heap of stone and ash. Vitellius replaced the banner with his own and began rebuilding the city. He, like his father, was an icon for the empire's Christian citizens. Christianity, while not outlawed, was a persecuted faith across much of the world, but sizable minorities of the Roman people still counted themselves among its members. At Ubersis, Vitellius reasoned, a new land could be built for Christians of all the world to enjoy. Germania, so rapidly ruined by war, could be reborn as a new Holy Land, with no enforcement of the empire's state pantheon of old Roman deities. As the first bricks were fired, the first clashes of the civil war began. The rebels in Gaul found themselves suddenly confronted with loyal troops from further inland. They had been pursuing a party of Alaman raiders who had so far escaped the Roman conquest of the region, but in doing so they came upon the scene of the rebel standoff. With so many additional troops joining the pro-Senate camp, a decisive move was now easy. The two main rebel armies were cut off from each other and could not coordinate their actions. Both wished to retreat and build more support, but they couldn't know where the other had gone. As a result, it came to pass that over the next few weeks, both groups faced combined loyalist armies and were utterly crushed. The rebellion in Gaul was over as soon as it had started, and now the Senate knew it had plenty of armies available to undo anything Verus might achieve. Although for that to truly be the case, they needed to survive. If Verus gathered enough troops, he would likely storm Rome, and the Senate would be first on the proscription list. Suddenly they weren't so sure that they had the upper hand. They needed a plan to stop Verus, and one that somehow circumvented the fact that he was a veteran military leader with elite troops at his command. They considered a myriad of plans, but no agreement could be found. The arrival of Eutropius to the Senate chamber silenced the debate. There would be no scheming or politics. He would take the remnants of the Praetorian Legion and fight Verus head-on. The Senate already considered Eutropius to be slow-witted, but this was just idiocy to them. They invoked their enshrined right to veto the Magister's decision, but by the time the formalities of the legal instrument were dealt with, Eutropius and the Praetorian troops could no longer be found in the city. Near Rhugion, the Roman troops could not be so stealthy. Any hill afforded a view of the trail their army and baggage train cut through the snow, bisecting the fields in a straight line from the horizon to the edge of town. Without delay, the troops threw off their winter cloaks and formed up, ready to partake in the heat of battle instead. Their leader, Anicius Piso, waited to the south with the cavalry, while the bulk of his forces prepared for battle on the open ground to the east. Their first major concern was the collection of ships approaching from the north. Their course seemed to have them bound to land on the Roman flank. Responding in the manner in which they had been trained, the legionaries rushed to screen the beaches and push back any amphibious assaults. The Roman military had faced this scenario so many times before that it was only natural to include their tried and true counter-strategy in legionary training. But the same history that informed Rome was available to the Allemans too. They knew the Romans would rush to meet them if they threatened to beach their ships. Now the legionaries were close enough to the water that they were vulnerable. From around the spit upon which Rhugion was founded came additional ships. On their decks were onagers, weapons designed to destroy ships and buildings that would work just as well against tightly packed Roman formations. They intended to take the Romans by surprise, and had the attack been made at dawn they likely would have succeeded. But by attacking as soon as they arrived, the Romans enjoyed good visibility. The weak afternoon fog did not conceal the approaching sails. The Romans recognized the design of the ships immediately. An exaggerated forecastle and high waterline indicated a siege craft with heavy ammunition. They fell back to safety, but in doing so lost control of the beach. The sailors took this chance to disembark in peace. Once ashore, they rushed towards the safety of Rhugion, but among them ran the crews of the siege ships. They had abandoned their craft to stick with the rest of the navy. That meant there was nothing keeping the Romans at a distance. Walls of shields advanced through the icy fields, forcing many groups of marines to stop and fight for their lives. They were outnumbered and lightly equipped. Fleeing was the only hope for survival, but the route to Rhugion was cut off immediately. The harsh training the legionaries had endured granted them remarkable speed even with their heavy gear. The fighting was quickly over, and was an even more decisive blow than the Romans knew. Among the sailors they had killed was the king of the Allemans, Cancor, dressed unassumingly to sneak into Rhugion undetected. At most, only a quarter of the sailors made it to the town, many of them being the siege engineers responsible for the disaster. While only little daylight remained, the Roman attack resumed. They began to weaken Aleman defences by raining fire arrows onto their eastmost watchtower. It was a frustrating task for the Roman archers. Setting fire to a structure from a distance is difficult at the best of times, but with a layer of snow and ice to break through, they were going to have to work for a long time, suffering casualties to return fire throughout. Finally, smoke began to rise, and very quickly after that the first tower crumbled. Now the fire arrows could be left behind, and the armour-piercing battle arrows employed. The archers switched target from the defences to the defenders, and began to rain arrows on the groups of Germanic warriors holding the nearest entry point. Shields and armour gave some respite from the bombardment, but the narrow tips of the Roman arrows found ways to break both. Roman troops advanced beneath the ceiling of arrows, threatening to storm the town at any moment. This pressure was not enough to push the defenders back. They stood and waited for a charge, arrows claiming the lives of each man one by one. Soon there were few left able to hold a shield. One man still standing was Hughard, leader of the garrison in the absence of the king. Each man who stood at his side was claimed by the missile attack, and finally he was too. Hope for a successful defence began to fail. Hundreds already lay dead, and the famous legionaries were still warming themselves in their testudos. For a short time the eastern entrance to the town was undefended, but troops from further in emerged to take up the impossible station. Stepping over piles of dead and wounded, these new defenders were lightly armoured in comparison to their predecessors, and the Romans were not yet out of arrows. After a few volleys left scores dead, they decided they would not stay to see the slaughter to its conclusion. As a result, the pile of corpses they had held now fell under the shadow of Roman shields. Finally, a chance to fight hand-to-hand arose for the Alamans, a practice they took great pride in. First, as in all things, came the horsemen, charging down the road into the front of the Roman shield wall. Their momentum killed many, but they didn't make it all the way through. Close quarters fighting broke out, with the Romans still having the advantages of numbers and equipment quality. As the cavalry faltered, they were replaced with a rush of warriors, mostly spearmen with heavy armour. They were more of a match for the legionaries, and their presence turned the balance of numbers in the Alamans' favour. It may have seemed hopeful for them, but in the heat of the moment it was easy to forget that the majority of the Roman army had not yet been deployed. By focusing so many of their best warriors on a small part of the legion, the rest of the town was exposed to attack. A probing cavalry raid made a clean run through another entrance point, cutting down much of the lightly armed company keeping watch. They were repulsed by arrows and bolts, losing half their number, but they had seen all they needed to see. Most of the town was now barely defended at all. This was the moment Anicius had been waiting for. His horsemen rushed to join the battle from the south and west, smashing into the Alaman light infantry and destroying them at every approach. A detachment of infantry engaged the last of the heavy troops, locking them in place so that Anicius himself could lead his Praetorian guards and legionary cavalry to smash them from the flank. They, and a group of lighter cavalry who had arrived to support them, were annihilated. More troops would rush to try and stop the advance of this second Roman push, but they would fail absolutely. The Romans took control of most of the town quickly, killing the dregs of the defending force by the hundreds. The remaining warriors, still locked in an indecisive battle with the initial attacking party, saw that they were going to be surrounded and tried to escape. But the only way out was through the Romans they were fighting. Only a lucky few would make it away. Rhegion was in Rome's hands. The Alaman king was dead, and so were most of their troops. Further east still they had another bastion, isolated and infertile, but clinging on. Was it enough to threaten Rome? The Alamans seemed to think so. They rejected offers of truce, but it would not be long before that decision would have them in chains. Victory against the barbarian threat was now inevitable. There was just one more battle the Romans needed to win in Europe, the battle against Verus. Between Rome and Ravenna, Magister Eutropius marched one half of the Praetorian Legion to meet the other half in battle, with Magister Verus at their head. As the armies drew close, Eutropius wrote to Verus, encouraging him to reconsider. "You'll find that there is nothing evil about a rule by democratic means, nothing at all. It is in fact rather liberating to not have all the responsibilities of the state on a single weak pair of mortal shoulders. If you were only to accept a position in the Senate, perhaps a governorship, I think you'd find the balance quite relaxing. It's what Rome always wanted to be like, after all. No tyrants and no Christians." A reply was returned the same day. "The Senate rules with powers it once declared illegal. The Senate disrespects the tens of thousands of loyal Romans who died to keep it from being set aflame. They must be thrown away, or everything will just start again. The fall of Rome was the doing of their ilk, and it was saved by men like me and the men of your own family. If you cannot see that, then you must die, for the sake of all of us." Neither side wished to avoid battle. The next morning, despite the terrible weather, the armies formed up. Varus commanded an enormous hill and had troops that almost exactly matched those of Eutropius in number and quality. An attack was risky, but Eutropius did not see it that way. Accustomed to winning one way or another, he ordered his men to begin climbing the muddy slope towards Varus. Both armies had huge artillery pieces at their disposal, and that gave Varus another advantage still. He could lie in wait with pre-sighted weapons, while Eutropius had to either leave his behind or drag them up the steep hill 1 inch at a time. Caring not for the difficulty it would cause his men, he chose the latter option. A few steps for the infantry would mean a few minutes' delay while the artillery crawled along behind them, and the whole time the skies had to be monitored for enemy bombardments. They made it some distance up the hill, but still could not see the summit or any of Varus's troops. Lacking scouts, Eutropius had to order his Praetorian lancers to ride ahead and determine what exactly they were about to walk into. They surveyed the hillside and its spread of copses, finding nothing out of the ordinary. They reached the very top of the hill without resistance, and even found that the large woodland at its crown was deserted, despite being of perfect size and placement to conceal Varus's army. Every man in the loyalist force presumed that they must be walking into an extremely devious trap, all except Eutropius, who did not even consider the possibility. He was more allured by the possibility that his troops could now occupy the most defensible spot for miles around. Even if Varus was planning a trap, he could not spring it on them once he was dug in at the summit. While the army nervously climbed on, the lancers explored the woodlands further. They were as untouched as Eutropius had hoped. Something more interesting was discovered too. Some of Varus's troops were seen guarding the eastern slope of the hill. Eutropius lit up at the news. Varus had made a huge mistake. He had presumed that given the steepness of the slope, the unevenness of the terrain and the strength of the downpour, that Eutropius would not dare climb the southern face of the hill with his artillery in tow. Varus had thus prepared to defend against attacks from the open, flat ground to their east. He was about to receive a nasty surprise. Eutropius formed up atop the hill, keeping his army out of sight, but making note of the positions reported to him by the scouting lancers. It was within the range of his artillery. Dragging them up the hill was about to pay off in the extreme. Pots of explosive cocktails were loaded and launched over the crest of the hill. The sound of a loading alone alerted Varus to his mistake, but there was no time to move. Explosives fell down upon his army, striking an early blow against his own artillery. The hillside he occupied was itself shielding his men from the attack, making it nearly impossible for shots fired from such a distant position to find a target. But his artillery pieces continued to fall. The size that made them so deadly was now making them the only thing Eutropius could expect to hit. Varus ordered the whole army to quickly ascend to the summit before Eutropius charged down from the heights, but Eutropius had in fact left his men around the artillery. Varus would be able to take ground equal to or higher than the loyalists then, but that didn't matter. As the Praetorians reached the top of the hill, they came into full view of the artillery, and the bombardment suddenly became much more deadly. These soldiers were the best fighters the Empire could produce, but that meant nothing in the face of the caustic blasts each artillery impact brought. Eutropius's men had the same weakness, but thanks to the surprise attack, Varus would have to move his artillery up the hill also to be able to get to stable ground that was within attack range. It would take several minutes to complete this move, and he had none of them to spare. His troops had only one viable strategy left: reach the loyalist lines before they were wiped out. Slowed by the wet ground and their heavy armour, the rebel Praetorians charged with everything they had across the plateau, losing half their number or more to the unrelenting barrage that Eutropius's well-drilled crews were unleashing. As they closed in on their foe, arrows and javelins were added to the mix, striking into their shields and heavy armour, but not preventing their arrival. Eutropius's Praetorians now received the rebel attack. starting a brutal melee that would ultimately only be won now by the more numerous and well-rested side. Missiles continued to smash any rebel who wasn't already embroiled in the front line, and even those who were. Eutropius was ruthless with his loyal troops, for they too had at least tacitly consented to Verus' march on Rome. Verus himself joined the battle, riding at the head of a unit of horsemen considered elite even among Praetorian troops. They smashed into the front line, but they did not break it. Now locked in position, they could only struggle their way through, probably noting that much of Eutropius' line was not being engaged and so could surround them at any time. Such maneuvers would not be required. Another danger-close round of explosive shells was launched straight into the front line. What damage it did to the infantry mattered not, for it killed almost all of the rebel horsemen, including Verus himself. There could be no surrender for the remaining rebels, and likely no escape. They fought on in small groups as the wings of Eutropius' army swept forward to claim the battlefield. Only now did the remaining rebel artillery reach the top of the hill. Some of it was destroyed immediately by a counter-artillery attack, then finally the first rebel shots were released. They did negligible damage, and the loyalist army finished off all resistance within moments. Before the last artillery pieces could be destroyed, they managed another volley, launching solid rocks that killed the man riding right beside Eutropius himself. A close call indeed, but also the last call. The artillery crumbled under return fire, and the last surviving rebels, 50 or so Praetorian legionaries, were flattened under a hail of arrows. Eutropius' victory was complete. There would be one Magister in the Roman Empire, and he would not be the stomping hero that Verus dreamed of. The victory against Verus would be followed by several pieces of good news. Macran was completely destroyed, securing the eastern edge of the empire once again. The Garamantians surrendered under overwhelming pressure from Britannian and Western Rome, becoming a puppet state of the former. The Caucasian separatists, having backed the wrong horse, were conquered without trouble by Vitellius, eager to take control of their majority Christian population. The acquisition of such a demographic brought the issue of Christianity to the forefront in the Senate. Christianity had become associated with the weakness of the previous empire, just as the return to paganism had seemingly kick-started the revival. While Christianity remained the more accessible religion, the official codification of the Roman pantheon and its rituals meant that paganism had become more akin to a very large and broad organized religion. With more than half of the population practicing it in some form, the pagan agenda could be translated into legislation easily, especially now that matters of war were ceasing to dominate political discourse. As such, Christianity became a restricted faith. While it was still not outright illegal to be Christian, it now came with a variety of sanctions and loss of rights. Vitellius was stripped of his claim to govern the Christian colonists he had recruited, and would eventually be forced to abandon his troops and become a mere envoy to Western Rome. The proportion of Christians in the empire dropped down into a single-digit percentage, still forming the second largest religious affiliation, but holding almost no influence. There was more good news for the ruling elite. Piso had forced the Alamans to surrender. He had placed a Roman sympathizer on their throne, effectively taking control of all of their remaining troops. The wars with the barbarians were over, and while they would occasionally fight among themselves, the empire was now out of their reach. In Rome, the celebrations of victory began, but there was one last loose end to tie up. What had happened to Costa? The question was answered some weeks later by his sudden return from the desolate steppe. The men he had deserted with were all still alive and in good order. Clearly, wherever he had been, he had found some prey. Now the men who had refused to depart with him were his quarry. They had settled in some of the ruins their previous campaign had left behind, hoping to start their own colony out of sight from the rest of the empire. Not much work had been completed, and so they were forced to defend themselves amid piles of rubble and burnt-out buildings. Unfortunately, as you might expect, these offered very little in the way of protection. Costa's men, still burning with bloodlust, rushed into the town, dodging blind-fired artillery and digging their spears into the panicked loyalists. Costa himself was at the forefront of the brawl, hacking through the troops he had marched with for so many years. A heavy war dart found its way into his shoulder, but in the focus of the moment he was able to quite literally shrug it off. Rank by rank the loyal troops were depleted, with countless Roman lives being taken by Costa's very own blade. Victory was almost certainly his, but it would come at a price. Amid a hail of lead shot, he found his armour pierced, his horse killed, and by the force of the collapse onto a ground covered in discarded weapons, he was vanquished before his next breath. He had been bested by a group of Persian light troops, who according to legends were so blessed by the gods for this deed that they became able to make rugs and carpets levitate off the ground, beginning a traditional feat of magic still widely referenced today. The rebels killed the loyal Romans down to the last man, but had lost a third of their own number and their maniacal leader. The colony was quickly recaptured by Septimus the Younger, newly appointed as the so-called Praetor of Low Kings, a role in which he could delight himself with his superiority to the vassal kings of the Iranian plateau. He would order these vassals to pursue and kill the surviving rebels in the coming months, a task they took pleasure in completing. Septimus's promotion came at the same time that Publius Paulus was removed from office amid accusations of embezzlement. He seemed to have gifted himself a large portion of the tax income from Mesopotamia and Arabia and invested it in a lavish personal estate outside of Alexandria. This estate would end up in the hands of the man who had first detected the financial irregularities, the retiring Anicius Basileus. When the separatists in Sardinia were crushed by Roman landing forces, the madness was at long last over. Europe, Africa and Asia were secured, and all the empire's lands knew peace. None could challenge Rome's dominance over the world. Their nearest rival was their own sister state, the Western Roman Empire of Iberia and Western Africa, and they were a vassal of the Britannian Romans in all but name. In fact, their encouragement of Christianity, in a world being so forcefully told how dangerous such practices were, only diminished their influence over time. Their integration into the greater empire became more than just a dream for activists in both Roman governments. Thanks to the near-deathbed marriage of Quintus Vitellius into the Western imperial family, the very last emperor of Western Rome would one day be able to trace his ancestry straight back to the man then venerated as a son of Mars, Constantinus. Before such lofty projects could be considered, it was time to rebuild the world. Decades of war had erased centuries of progress, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Only Rome had the resources and the will to restore these lands to their former glory, and so instead of hosting enemies as they had for the old empire, they would provide the empire's greatest riches. Politically, both the Senate and the Magisterium had proven themselves to be of worth, but to some extent they were at odds with each other. The Magister had executive power, but the Senate could make binding requests of the Magister. The rule of Eutropius Salutius saw this contradiction become normalized. The Senate was regularly allowed to dictate the movements of military assets, despite such power being entirely in Eutropius's hands. By simply agreeing to their every request, it set an influential precedent for how the Magisterium, a set of offices designed for fighting wars, was to be treated in peacetime. The role of Magister would eventually become part of the Senate itself. It was an office with supreme powers over all but the other senators, and was by unwritten law obliged to rule in accordance with the majority opinion of the Senate. It was precisely what the founder of the office feared would happen. It was a republican monarchy. An inherited position of supreme military commander lodged beneath a supposedly elected body of rich elites. Effectively, the Senate ran the military, and very few of these men knew anything about how to do it. Septimus Gergus had predicted that such an arrangement would collapse the empire under the pressure from outside it, and Gaius Verus had given his life fighting to prevent this from coming to pass. However, both had overlooked an important factor that would have allayed their fears. There was no one outside the empire able to attack it. Almost the entire population of the Roman world was inside the empire and wouldn't have it any other way. The empire did not need to be perpetually ready for war as its predecessor had, for all wars were already won. That Rome even allowed other states to exist was surprising, and likely was only the case because it was easier to conquer unoccupied territory than the scraps of land still held by potentially unruly barbarians or Easterners. This new Rome was greater than the empire it had replaced by far, with shorter borders, better troops, and far greater social and political unity. The elected Senate was at least not unpopular like many kings and emperors of old, while the legions were feared and awed across the world. So many had seen the damage that war could do that peace was now desirable at any price. Submission to the empire was a natural choice for new territories, and pride in the empire was strong for the old Roman core. It didn't matter much what state one lived in anymore, for the Roman state was good enough for the tired majority. The massive economy created through this unified administration could do great things, including give its citizens a lowered rate of taxation. The explosion in worship for the Roman gods indicated not just a tolerance for Roman society, but a desire to be a part of it. Roman rule was too good to lose, so now it would stay for good. The Constantine dynasty had led the world away from the brink, and had been made its overseers in return. The Roman Empire would now rebuild, restore, and rule in a new age of peace, developing as one and pulling itself together whenever its own disputes saw swords drawn. Pax Romana was finally a reality again. The Romans would bring about the golden age of the first millennium, centuries of regeneration that saw the foundations of the modern world placed across Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Asia. With the development of ocean-going ships starting to appear in records, we can only imagine where such momentum might have taken the empire if it hadn't faced its most famous interruption. Well done for making it to the very end of Fields of Mars. This time next week there'll be a vote to decide my next project, so look out for that if you're watching this in time. For now, make your sacrifices to Mars and enjoy Pax Romana. See you soon.